PhD candidate in political studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. He's the author of a number of journal articles in journals including Sport in Society, Relaciones Internacionales. I think that's an Argentinian journal. Nokoko, which I believe is an African Studies journal. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah.
And so he's authored a number of online policy briefs and is currently working on an ongoing project on the future of sustainable protein. So it's interesting. And he's the editor-in-chief of the graduate journal Potentia. Did I pronounce that right, Andrew? And he's also the commissioning editor of International Relations, which is where the article, which many of you have read as part of your level 5 course, where the article, Why COVID Will Not Be Good for the Environment. So yeah, and this is what Andrew's going to be speaking about today. So I will hand over the floor to Andrew. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'd definitely like to thank the organizers as well from the university for having found my paper and for putting on this very interesting and great event. I think it's really always a win when we can find these types of ways to share different debate and academic thought on timely and important subjects like this. Excuse me. So I'm here to talk tonight about the many issues that COVID-19 is presenting to the world, specifically relating to the environment, but it is important to also acknowledge the many opportunities it is presenting as well. Not the least of which, as we were kind of chatting about earlier, is this very presentation. While I've had to cancel a number of trips to different places around the world, to different conferences over the past 6 months, and I definitely do not foresee traveling anywhere for at least the next 6 months or who knows how long, I do think it has pushed us to innovate as a society in general, but also specifically within the academia to innovate in different ways so that we can host these types of forums. And I think it's a great medium of exchange. And while everyone is probably in agreement that you cannot duplicate the in-person experience, it is important that we increasingly utilize digital technology in order to maximize the sharing of information and ideas while trying to flatten inequalities, and specific to this talk, helping to lessen our impact on the environment. On that note, I believe most of you will have read my short piece in the online journal International Relations, as was mentioned. I do think this is another example of how utilizing technology can be done really well. As mentioned, I'm a commissioning editor with the journal, and we have a dynamic team of editors from around the world. Most of us have never met. I don't know if any of us have ever been in the same room together, but the journal publishes a substantial volume of high quality research in an entirely online platform with, as far as I know, zero travel and zero paper ever being printed. So these are the kinds of innovations, along with tonight's talk, that I think we can continue to work on and try to make the best out of what is undoubtedly an unfortunate situation. Excuse me. So the piece I wrote very early on in the lockdown in my country in Canada, which began in earnest on Friday the 13th of March. I remember that day really well because I was actually presenting research in a conference on our campus at the University of Ottawa, and it was from fieldwork I had just completed in Namibia. I spent most of the winter in Africa, which was much nicer than the winter in Canada. And the timing worked out great because I got back just in time to be free for about 2 weeks, and then lockdown started. And while today there remains a great deal of uncertainty with everything that is going on with the virus, back in the spring there was even more so. We had no idea what was going on. And I think my article maybe reflects a bit too much of that. So one of the things I do want to discuss tonight, aside from the contents of the article, which discusses many of the challenges of the environment and what it will face as a result of COVID-19, is to also discuss the opportunities that are being presented to us, which we must not waste. For this, I argue, will be a defining moment of climate change in our history. And if we fail to capitalize the way we have been failing for several decades, I think much of the worst of what climate scientists have been warning for years will likely come to fruition. But before I get to that, I will start with the more ominous content of the article so that we can then perhaps finish on a slightly brighter note prior to opening up the floor to questions, which I am very happy to answer. I'll try and keep my remarks rather short, as I understand we have a very diverse audience, I think from multiple countries and I guess multiple continents. So I would love to hear as many diverse perspectives as possible come out in your questions. And while I would not consider myself an expert on this topic, I do think it will make for some interesting conversation at the end. So COVID-19 has been a global pandemic that has been devastating for many across the world and has negatively impacted almost every aspect of life. It was initially said to be one of the great equalizers, as it could infect anyone, rich or poor, black or white. But we now know this is quite inaccurate, really, because it's actually compounding pre-existing inequalities and further marginalizing those most marginalized in society already. From a health perspective, it affects people of color, minorities, low-income populations, and people of that sort at a greater rate than others. And similarly, from an economic perspective, it is these same groups, as well as women we know, who have been disproportionately affected by job losses and income loss. One of the few bright spots that people were quick to point to soon after China went into lockdown back in the winter was an almost immediate and noticeable decrease in greenhouse gases above its skies. Following this, as lockdown spread west from China, there were stories of the canals in Venice clearing up, wildlife was reappearing in places that had not been seen for decades. And since then, there's been a lot of discussion that I think we're in agreement that global greenhouse gas emissions might drop by about 8% in 2020 overall, which will basically be the largest drop ever in modern recorded human history. So this is basically good news, right? Well, the short answer I would say is yes. We need climate action now and to decrease emissions now in order to meet the Paris climate goals of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees in order to stave off catastrophic climate change. And populations around the world who depend on healthy ecosystems need cleaner water, more productive soils, and the protection of biodiversity and ecological health in order to prosper sustainably. So yes, the many environmental wins we're seeing as a result of COVID-19 are absolutely welcome and absolutely good in the short term. The problem, I would argue, is that climate change is not a short-term issue and requires both short, but specifically long-term solutions to treat it effectively. To this point in our history, one of the lessons we have learned is that unfortunately, effective climate action is very often treated as a luxury, despite the fact that this should absolutely not be the case because it is not a luxury anybody can afford. By this, I mean citizens are generally most willing to support effective climate action and, more importantly, pay for climate action when the economy is going well, when unemployment is low, and when there is no major political turmoil or international crises, etc. Well, without going through a global case-by-case basis, I think it is safe to assume that the majority of countries from every region on the planet are experiencing their own set of all of these challenges in one way or another. And these challenges, unfortunately, are unlikely to subside anytime soon, I think. Furthermore, if and when they do subside, the amount of global debt that will have piled up is going to form some sort of ongoing challenge, if not crises, for the foreseeable future. The effects of globalization have sort of over the past several decades led to a slow upheaval that has in part led to populist uprisings around the globe and caused a considerable amount of tension in the international system. This is perhaps epitomized by Donald Trump, who, if all goes well, will hopefully be replaced in the coming months. However, unfortunately, he's really just a symptom, albeit a very, very bad one, of the wider discontent and much deeper issues which will not disappear with his departure from the White House. But similar to these complex and serious issues, I fear that in some ways COVID-19 will have done in 6 months what globalization did in perhaps a couple of decades. There are a number of entire industries that will likely not survive, while others will be changed forever, certainly. Many people, like I assume most of you, and certainly myself here right now, have been working from home for, again, the past 6 months, and I will be here for the foreseeable future. We're doing quite well in Canada, but I'm not back to work and don't plan on being back to campus anytime soon. So these are the kind of major shifts that we're really going to be feeling. Massive global industries like travel and tourism, I cannot imagine to be back to their full might, churning income into economies around the world. And unfortunately, it tends to be those developing economies which tend to benefit most from travel and tourism, and those which are now being hurt most. All of this is going to result in painful economic restrictions at a number of levels that will be difficult for individuals, it will be difficult for states, and it will continue to put pressure on a liberal world order that has already been struggling a great deal for a number of years. All of this might add up to decreased emissions this year, it will add up to decreased emissions this year, and it might even add up to decreased emissions next year, and who knows, maybe the year after. However, we need to continue decreasing emissions by about 8% per year, every year for the foreseeable future in order to achieve the Paris Declaration goals. And the current economic slowdown alone will not provide these kinds of improvements year over year as economies open back up and leaders do all they can to get people back to work. No crisis in the past has been quite like this one, and none have seen such a significant drop in emissions as this one. However, what they have all had in common is quickly rebounding greenhouse gas emissions, which pick up where they left off in their climb ever toward the impending climate crisis. Already there have been calls globally with a number of different industries in a number of different countries to lower environmental regulations that took so long and so much political capital to get in place to begin with. Various industries have argued that without doing so, without lowering these restrictions, they won't be able to be competitive. And many companies, or in some cases, the entire industries will go belly up and lead to even further economic hardship, job loss, and economic decline. The oil and gas sector has been sort of symbolic of all of what is going on, as it is obviously a very highly polluting industry that has also been subject to instability and wide fluctuations. The onset of the pandemic partly coincided with and partly exacerbated massive decreases in oil prices that were already still struggling to recover from several price shocks over the past decade. This has been symbolic of the type of difficult choices we all have to make moving forward. In Canada, as with elsewhere, there have been calls from the oil sector for economic bailouts, lowering environmental regulations, and to cut the carbon tax that was only recently put in place by the Liberal government here. These are difficult choices, as many people's real lives and livelihoods rely on these large sectors. And if the entire oil industry in Canada were to go belly up overnight, the economic fallout would be almost unimaginable. However, the oil sector, I would say, like with the global economy and COVID-19 recovery, also presents opportunities, as discussed. For the oil sector, this is not time for bailouts, but time for massive investment from both the public and private sectors to transform these industries to provide better, cleaner, cheaper, more reliable forms of energy with technologies we can then export to the developing world to help them realize a cleaner and more sustainable recovery as well. From broader perspectives, some of the positives I see coming from this COVID-induced environmental recovery is that it should provide hope to the environmental movement and should, I repeat, should put an end to climate deniers. It should provide hope to environmentalists, like I'm assuming many of us are, because we are seeing that our actions can have a substantial positive impact in a relatively short period of time. One of the most difficult things for me personally researching climate change and related environmental issues is how hopeless things can often seem. I myself lean back and forth between optimism that we will come together and do what needs to be done, and pessimism due to the ongoing inaction and the environmental doomsday clock ticking ever nearer, which seems to never stop. But the current situation does show that with concerted action, we can take the steps necessary to prevent catastrophic climate change and to clean up our local environments and waterways. I'm not sure if any of you have been to the canals in Venice at a normal time. I have. It's a magical place, but the water is not something you would want to swim in. But comparing it from what I saw it about 2 years ago to the photos that have been coming out of Italy in the past few months, it's really incredible to see the improvements that were made in such a short period of time, similar to so many other stories we have been seeing in the news. This is one important example of why we should have some hope. The quick shift in environmental quality and greenhouse gas emissions should similarly poke gaping holes, if there weren't already enough, in arguments that climate change is not human-induced, as so clearly limiting human activity these past few months has so quickly had such vast impacts on the environment that one need not even believe 99% of the world's scientists, and can instead in real time see direct impacts through either satellite imagery with our own eyes or from firsthand accounts of cleaner skies almost worldwide. So to sum up, I fear COVID-19 will not be good for the environment and for the global fight against climate change, but it can be. An excerpt from a recent report that I read from the Smith School by Cameron Hepburn, Joseph Stiglitz, and some other environmental economists reads, "There are reasons to believe that we will leap from the COVID frying pan into the climate fire, because the climate emergency is like the COVID emergency, just in slow motion and much graver." And I couldn't agree more, unfortunately. I do think that the next emergency we're going to be facing might not be so acute, but it will probably be much worse. I don't want to minimize the seriousness of the current global pandemic in any way, but it is something that at some point we will get under control and we will put behind us. There is much less certainty with the prospect of the climate emergency at this time, and it is a fire I fear we are already smoldering in. The short-term environmental wins we are already seeing must be built upon through tough decisions and decisive action. There will be historic stimulus packages being developed. I foresee trillions of dollars being poured into economies around the world as we move past the emergency health phase of the pandemic and embark on the road to economic recovery eventually. It is up to us if we want to work towards returning to where we were pre-COVID, or if we want to innovate to use targeted investments in order to build a cleaner society that is more just and, importantly, more sustainable. For if we do not act now, and the recovery goes the same way recoveries from previous crises have, it may well be too late, and the next acute crisis we'll be facing will be one entirely of our own making. So with that, I would like to thank you all very much, and I certainly welcome any questions, and we'll do my best to answer as many as we can get.
Thanks ever so much, Andrew. That was really interesting. So yeah, as Andrew said, if we want to open up the floor now to questions. So there are two ways you can do this, guys. You could either put them into the chat box, so you see at the bottom right of your screen, or if you'd like to say it over the microphone, please just, I think there's, I don't see it on my option because I'm a host, but there's the raise hand one. So if you do the raise hand, and I will bring you in on the mic. So it looks like Juan Pablo Camacho has a question. Juan Pablo, I'll just unmute you. Okay.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. So my question is, how could you get these important messages to people who don't like read, or those who do not know about this?
Sorry, how do we get the message to people who might not know about it?
Who don't like to read?
Well, each individual's action is certainly important.
Yeah.
I think what's going to be more important is political actions moving forward. So I do hope that, I mean, there's one president in the United States who's famed for not reading, but I do hope that most people in governments are reading. I think that governments are aware that there is an issue. I do think that they need to take the initiative on themselves to act, but people need to push them to act as well. And if you know someone who doesn't read, then you should be out in the neighborhood talking to them. And anybody who can talk to somebody and explain it to them or help them understand whether you're using social media to disseminate information to those who might not read. I do think it is all of our jobs to push each other so that we can get more and more people pushing governments. I know here it's been a debate for 15 years whether we should have a carbon tax, and there was a previous liberal leader who really was the first person to run on it, and he got decimated in an election. And after that election, a conservative government was in power for about 10 years. So nobody wanted to touch the idea of a carbon tax again until finally there was enough people. We had an election almost a year ago in Canada. And for the first time, it became one of the top 3 issues in the election was climate change. We've never had that before. It's a matter of talking to your neighbors, putting it on social media, instead of people thinking that carbon taxes will cost more. You have to explain to them that, I mean, here we made ours revenue neutral, which was hard for people to understand, but it doesn't cost us as Canadians more because we get it back in our income taxes. So it's about putting out the right kind of messages, explaining to people that it's going to cost us more in the long run, that we won't be able to have livelihoods, that things like COVID-19 actually came out partly because of climate change. There's no direct link from COVID to climate change, no causal science, but it's very, very likely that it had a hand in bringing it out, and same with future pandemics. So it's unfortunate that some people either don't believe it or don't read the science, but I think it's really up to all of us to do all we can to bring them along. And we as academics have an important role in that as well, because if we speak to just each other in our ivory towers, we're not really doing our job. So I think that we're doing a better job in innovating to get out. I think, again, publishing in things like EIR rather than strictly academic journals is a good way to get out thought that's a little bit more easy for the public to understand.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, for that question. Jesus Betin, looks like you've got a question. I'll just unmute you. There we go.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Andrew. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah. What's your question?
Okay, so my question is basically, you believe that institutions like the United Nations should create policy brief or kind of ideas so country get samples to create or to protect the environment, aiming to that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that's a really key point. I think it speaks to a much broader point. So I touched on, I've mentioned Trump a couple times, and the idea of populism more generally. And all of that kind of comes back to the attack on multilateralism that's been going on for the past couple of years. And I think that is one of the biggest issues we're facing. I mean, as a concrete issue, it might be climate change, but climate change has to be dealt with politically, and to deal with it politically, multilateralism is extremely important. The same way as it's important for fighting COVID-19, if we don't have the WHO effectively coordinating actions, we're going to be a lot less effective at stopping this pandemic. Same thing with climate change. I think that the UN plays an absolutely central role and should do all it can. But again, that comes from countries funding it. If the US, which has always been a global leader, is stepping back from these organizations, it weakens them and it undermines their credibility. If lesser known countries or less powerful countries like Canada or Colombia are also pulling back resources, it undercuts their ability to do so. So again, I think it comes, it starts from the ground up, but we need to pressure governments to really understand the importance of these issues, so that our governments can properly resource multilateral organizations, make sure that they are given full credibility, so that when they issue reports and papers, that they're listened to and that they're effective and they're accurate. Because now more than ever, there's important for people to have faith in government and in multilateral institutions. And I think, speaking to your question, absolutely, the UN plays a central role in it, and should really be a world leader on pushing as much stuff as they can through to really disseminate the importance of acting now.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Jesus. Let's go on to Juan Camilo. Juan Camilo Prieto. It's one of my students. Hello, Juan Camilo. I will just unmute you. Juan Camilo, what's your
Hello,
question?
Martin.
Hey.
Good afternoon. I would like to know your opinion of the solar panels, because in this week we listened to the Bill Gates TED Talk, and he said that the solar panels are difficult to implement because many square kilometers will be needed for their implementation, and their cost in some countries is still high.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we need to be really thoughtful with our solutions. And this is, again, going to be a time to really think about how we want this recovery to look. Over the past few recoveries, the best option or the best example is the 2008 global financial crisis. After that, it was how do we get money back into the economy? How do we get people back to work? The easiest answer was shovel-ready projects. And that is really something in Canada we're talking about getting away from, because it's not just about paving the newest lane in the highway, which is going to allow more cars to drive, and it's going to put more men back to work while not putting women back to work. It's really what do we want this recovery to look like long term? So you don't want to be flattening productive farmers' fields to put in solar panels and then have your population not able to eat or lose their food sovereignty. So it's a difficult question. I think that there is a huge place for much more solar to be produced in the world. I think that it's a great time to invest. I think that in Canada, I was mentioning that we should invest a lot in transforming what the oil sector does. I think it would be great if they could shift to producing bigger, better, more efficient, cheaper solar panels, for instance. But I think that they only have a place in some places. In much of the US, for instance, all around Arizona, huge parts of California are basically empty desert. It's too hot and dry for most people to live. It's a great place to have them, especially around places like Los Angeles where there's huge populations. I'm less familiar with Colombia. I think there's probably less open space. I don't think you want to be losing forest land for it or anything like that. So it does depend where it is. I did my field work in Namibia in the winter. It would seem like a great place for them because it gets ample heat. It's one of the driest countries in Africa. It's one of the most sparsely populated countries in the world. But it's so sparsely populated that there would be only a market that would make sense for them by the capital city, because that's the only place that draws enough electricity. Otherwise, you can have smaller fields, more localized in towns and that sort of thing. But I do think it like many things, everything about this recovery, I think you really have to think about the impacts. What are you giving up to put the solar panels there? And, do the people around there need it? Is there enough people to use the electricity? Is it going to be a really good long-term solution that will help the right kinds of people get out of this recovery?
Lovely. Thanks, Juan, for your question.
Thanks.
So let's go on now to Laura Carvajal. Just you've unmuted yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Oh,
sorry for that. This is my girlfriend's profile, but
okay.
However, I'm going to ask you some questions, Andrew. First off, I hope the cough you have while speaking doesn't have to do with the novel coronavirus, but just okay. And then I found your paper quite interesting. But I must confess that I'm kind of skeptical with what you propose, because on the one hand, you are saying that this coronavirus lockdown is not going to effectively have some positive effects in our environment. However, what has caused the biggest issues in terms of climate change are these way of in which we produce in the capitalism. You are saying that we can not abandon this because there are taxes behind the production. There are laws, regulation that take into account this production of greenhouse gases and stuff. And there are some environmental activists such as Al Gore, that has pointed out and has pointed out a limit a day for a big disaster that you are also foreseeing in your intervention. I could notice that you are foreseeing as well that a biggest crisis, environmental crisis, is coming. So I I'm skeptical because, as you said, there's factual evidence here by with the coronavirus that the environment actually has gotten better. For instance, you can take, for instance, the ozone layer that has recovered in these days. On the other hand, if you allow the production of products, the energy and stuff, fossil fuels and stuff, keeps their course as they used to be in the past, I don't know how the environment is going to actually improve. So I want you to go deeper in this regard and tell us about how is this that keeping this production, this mechanism is going to help us more than this lockdown. That's my.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So I think that really, really unpacks the intricacies and complexities of what I'm trying to get at. So first of all, I agree that I think that the good things that you guys are seeing environmentally there and that we've seen here and that they're seeing in China are good in the short term. And if we could keep them up, great. As I mentioned, I think there will be about an 8% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions this year. And we need to keep that up year after year, which would be great. Unfortunately, I don't think we need to keep up the same level and same type of capitalistic production we have been over the past too many decades. What I have seen is that every major recovery that has come after any kind of major crisis before has led to a dirtier kind of recovery, because at times like this, we were chatting a little bit before the talk. At times like this, people are desperate. I mean, people are losing their livelihoods. People are starving. Everybody just, wants to get back to work. And governments, whether in the developed or developing world, want to get people back to work. They want to be seen as the governments who got people back to work. So I fear that they will go back to any kind of dirty production, whether it is giving subsidies to oil companies, whether it is building massive new highways, whether it is building any type of infrastructure project. This is what I fear. And this is why I was arguing that I don't think it will be good for the environment, because there's just going to be so many people and governments that just want to get back to work, whatever that means. To your point, I think that is exactly what we don't need to do. I do think that we need to get everyone back to work, and it is imperative, because without offering people livelihoods, there can't really be effective environmental solutions. We do have to have the two together, but that's why we have to really think smartly about it. I don't really have the answers, but I do think that we need to be really smart in the coming months, because I do think that governments, as we get past the health emergency, will really start injecting trillions. It'll probably be unprecedented stimulus across the world in a lot of governments. There's rumblings that there's going to be, as an aside, actually, our finance minister just stepped down in Canada. There's rumor, I mean, it's for a lot of reasons, but there's rumors that he stepped down because he was at odds with our prime minister, who wants to, we're going to run about a $300 billion deficit this year because of COVID and because of the spending we've been doing as a result. And the finance minister thinks it's too much. The prime minister wants to go above and beyond that, because he sees this as a time. We have to keep the economy going. We have to get people back to work. And this might be like the turning point where we can somehow transfer to some sort of green economy. Again, I don't know what they're thinking and I don't have the solutions, but I do think that when we're injecting these billions or trillions of dollars into economies worldwide, as you said, we need them to not be business as usual. I don't want us to get back to business as usual before COVID-19. The economic prosperity was great. I want people to go back to work. I want people around the world to be able to eat, but we can't keep going the way we were, or one way or another, people won't be able to eat in the coming years or decades, probably less than decades at this point, because there'll be this ongoing climate emergency that's going to be even worse.
Okay, lovely. Let's just go, we've got a couple of comments here in the chat box. So Liliana Nino has said, I think this was in reference to the idea of the UN taking action on this issue. International politics or politicians don't care about the environment, for example, in Colombia. So yeah, this is a big issue at the moment. The Santurban Paramo is in danger because of big companies, multinational companies. They want to, I think it's to do with mining, or they want to do something in this this very delicate ecosystem. And developing countries are directly affected since they are not decision takers. Okay, and Jesus has agreed with this. Jesus Bedin, he said, sorry, I just lost the message there. I agree, but I don't think international politicians or politics does not care about the environment. They simply do not have the means to create change. And I believe governments should give in more legitimate power to international organizations like the UN in order to create global environmental policies. Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in. Oh, we did have someone with a raised hand, but she seems to have gone now. Okay, so well, let's have a look at some of these questions here in the chat box. So let's start with Javier Trujillo's, who said, what do you think of President Donald Trump's position on the coronavirus pandemic? So what do you think, Andrew?
I'll touch quickly on a couple of the other comments. I'd like to think that international politics and politicians care about the environment. I think that international politics, so I'm doing my PhD in political studies, but I'm majoring in international relations. This is what I study, especially the global politics behind climate change. I think it's one of the most difficult things out there, because with climate change, you can't really pin necessarily who's the one polluting, but then we all pay for it. We all get the effects from it, but then who's to pay for cleaning up? So there's really this dislocation. And if a bad actor out there like China or whoever else wants to pollute or work outside of the liberal international order, they're able to. I like to think that organizations like the UN care deeply. They do put a lot of effort into it. They're organizing the Conference of the Parties all the time. It's a very difficult issue. And again, I think the best way to get them to care more is to keep pushing it. If as I said, it came into the top 3 issues in our last Canadian election. If it did that in every election worldwide, leaders would be getting elected that cared about climate change, and they would be putting more resources into these types of organizations and be willing to listen to them more. At this point, there's too many shirkers or people who aren't willing to act, and then it makes the people who want to act not act. To the other question, honestly, there's not much I can say about Donald Trump. I think that his view on the coronavirus has been, I would almost say laughable, but it's tragic. It's really tragic because a lot of people have had to die that didn't have to. And similar to what we're talking about the environment, I really think it's unfortunate that he pulled the U.S., which is the world's biggest economy, and I think second biggest polluter, out of the Paris Declaration. I will say that he's only one person, and that I think there's a lot of good people in the U.S. and sub-state actors continue to put restrictions and environmental regulations, and hopefully someday he will have been a blip on the radar and nothing more.
Okay, thank you, Javier, for your question. Let's have a look just on the chat box here. Valentina, so I think actually that was the person who had her hand raised before. So she said, so after coronavirus, would the economic reactivation bring serious consequences for the environment?
Yeah, I fear they would. After, I don't have the statistics in front of me or remember them exactly, but again, for the 2008 financial crisis, emissions didn't drop very much. It was a different kind of crisis, right? I mean, economic productivity slowed down, but people kept flying everywhere. People kept going to work. So I think emissions might have dropped like 1% that year, which was actually substantial because they never really drop. But then they went right back up because governments again injected billions of dollars in stimulus into what tend to be dirty projects because they're looking for the shovel-ready projects, which used to be a good buzzword. Shovel-ready, it's a good investment. It's going to give you an economic return. That's one thing we're looking at not doing now because the shovel-ready ones aren't necessarily the, I don't know what you call them, future sustainability ready. So I think that, yes, we're going to have a bounce back in a hurry. If next year we're not back to where we were with emissions, then the following year I would think we will be. Because it's this desperation, right? People don't necessarily have the luxury to think about, do I have the extra 100 billion to turn this oil project into some sort of renewable energy thing? So I would like to think that there's going to be a bit of a green recovery and that countries who can will lead the way in some sort of renewable way. But I mean, the impetus for my paper was that I fear there won't be. So I do fear that the reactivation will have fairly serious consequences for the environment at what I fear also is a really pivotal time. I think the window is getting less and less open and it's becoming a problem.
Okay, so we'll just have time for maybe two more questions. So just two more in the chat box here. So we'll go with Izana's. Thank you, Izana, by the way, for setting up this event. So his question is, I was wondering if you could tell us about the Cartagena Protocol and perhaps evaluate its results.
I cannot say that I'm familiar with that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, neither can I. Zana, could you could you elaborate on this a little? Or?
Yeah, my understanding is the Cartagena Protocol was signed about 15 years ago. It was an agreement. Again, it's just off the top of my head. That it was an agreement for countries to comply with biodiversity and environmental control within the scope of biodiversity, and was signed obviously in Cartagena, Colombia. I'm asking the question because it's in Colombia, and it will be interesting to highlight on a specific protocol that was signed globally in Colombia, because that will be kind of a beacon for awareness, to going back to one of the questions of one of the students.
Yeah, well, I must say I'm apologize because I'm not familiar with it, so I can't quite speak to it. But I do think that those protocols, I think that their results are almost always underwhelming. But I think that there's an important place for them, and that they are important steps. And I think having them hosted in smaller, more developing countries like Colombia is very key, like you said. One of the recent Conference of the Parties was also hosted in Morocco, and I think that's a really important message to send to the global community that, we are getting all countries on board, and it's not just about the US and China, and whether or not they decide to go along, because it's going to be the countries that are developing today that will be the ones polluting tomorrow if they're not able to develop in a green way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, let's see. We'll go. Andrew, I don't know how you are for time, but I think
I'm fine.
So if we could fit in just maybe two more questions. There's two more from the students here. One is about, could you just tell us about the situation in Canada, how things are going? You kind of touched a little bit on this before, but yeah, if you could.
Yeah, so From a health virus perspective, it's been good. We were lucky. We got control of it pretty early. I think there's been about 9,000, just over 9,000, maybe almost 10,000 deaths in the country. But right now, I live in the biggest province, and we are having about 100 new cases per day, which is considered pretty good. We feel like we're on top of things. The lockdown restrictions have been loosened to level 3, which is as loose as it's going to get pretty much until there's a vaccine or something of some sort. We're able to go about our lives. We have to wear masks everywhere. Anybody who's able to work from home works from home. As I said, I haven't been to campus for a while. I'm teaching a course this fall. It will be all online. But if I want to go eat a meal, I can. I wear my mask into the restaurant, take it off at my table. So things have been good with that. From an economic standpoint, has the government been efficient? I think so. I mean, compared to other countries, we've been very lucky. The government instituted basically a guaranteed wage subsidy for people who lost work, which was fairly decent. If you made, kind of a mediocre wage, it would cover that. And it really covered everybody. I don't know anybody who fell through the cracks. So we've been really lucky with that. We've been financing it on debt. As I mentioned, we're gonna have a $300+ billion deficit this year, which is unheard of. We were projecting a $30 billion debt, and that was a huge political issue. And now it's above 300. So we're doing great. We're taking care of our people. Do think we'll keep the economy going. We're going to keep businesses open, but it's at the expense of, I guess, future generations paying off that debt. But for now, it's been pretty good. Also, if you're interested about how the government's doing, one thing that's really nice is trust in government is at an all-time high in Canada, which is really nice because I think it's something that's been waning around the world in recent years, whether it's trust in your government or international governments, multilateral agencies. It's been waning everywhere. So it has been nice to see those polls that show people trust government more than ever now.
Okay. So yeah, I think we just got time for one more question. So let's have a look. Let's just go with this one from Maria Camila Camargo. She says, have you studied the relationship between or among multilateral environmental agreements and the international economic system? Andrew?
A little bit. I mean, I think that they are one and the same. And that's actually a good question maybe to end on, because it does speak to what I'm trying to, part of what I was trying to get at, because I think that unfortunately we do well at dealing with tough issues like the environment when we're doing well collectively economically. When global growth is good, we do better collectively at innovating. A lot of economic productivity inevitably tends to lead to high emissions, but also we innovate so that it's kind of an investment down the road. Same thing with domestically. So internationally, I think that when there's more trust in international organizations and different multilateral organizations, when they're better resourced, they're also better at dealing with global environmental politics. If you look at a lot of the active global environmental organizations, they tend to be offshoots. I mean, there's like the UN IPCC, which is, a branch of the UN. So a lot of these are actually international organizations for the environment that work out of other multilaterals. So it's really, it's an ecosystem that all works together. And if the UN's not working well, then climate change is going to falter. If climate change action is completely faltering, it's likely because there's been a breakdown elsewhere. The WHO is not an environmental organization, but its health relies on that ecosystem. And it's kind of another thing that is unrelated to COVID, but that I've been fearing for the past 10 years or so, because with the populist waves, there's really been pressure on the liberal international order, which is built on these multilaterals. And without them, I think they're key, because we were talking about earlier, there needs to be some sort of centralized organizer of environmental efforts. globally, because otherwise there's going to be free riders and people will not necessarily do what they have to do. So the stronger we can make multilaterals, the stronger global environmental governance will be, and the more effective I think we'll all be at staving off the worst of the catastrophic climate change outcomes that might be coming.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you so much for speaking today. And yeah, and it's just these events are really useful for our students here at the Externado, just to be able to hear and to interact, because many of the people in the webinar today are studying international relations and government. So to be able to do these things in English is really useful for them in every sense. And yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up this evening. So thanks everyone for attending, and thank you again, Andrew, for agreeing to speak to us today. This has been really fantastic.
Thanks again for reaching out, for organizing, and thank you all very much for all of your questions. If you want to circulate my email for people, if they have any further questions, I'm happy to chat at any point. So hopefully it was useful.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much, and see you everybody, and hope to see you soon.
Bye guys.
Bye Andrew, thank you.